Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. Today we will discuss the anti-Semitism Jewish teens in America are facing and how to speak up against it. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, thinedgeofthewedge.com. I grew up in Elgin, Illinois, a Midwestern town in which the small Jewish community did not consist of Holocaust survivors. Our parents and grandparents fled the Tsar and other pogroms, the turn of the 20th century, and yet in September 1970, my U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives as Jews forever.
Aaron Bregman is the Director of High School Affairs for the Alexander Young Leadership Department at the American Jewish Committee. Previously, he was the Jewish History Department Chair and a teacher at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School in Rockville, Maryland. Aaron, welcome to our show. We're happy to have you on.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Aaron, I realized that I promised you that I would say where you grew up, and I got to tell Evelyn. So Danvers, Massachusetts is correct, right?
That's correct.
You
yes.
wanted to say it is part of what you're going to talk about later. But let's right now start with the problem. What kind of anti-Semitism are Jewish teens facing in high school?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, it's obviously the sort of fundamental question that I have to approach every day and think about. And I began this position in July of this past year, so July 2022. And ever since then, I received a number of different scenarios and areas where anti-Semitism has been unfortunately on the rise. There have been swastikas, as I'm sure you can appreciate, and heard about, found in bathrooms or on desks. We've had, certainly where I live in the DC area, Montgomery County, schools spray painted with "Jews are not welcome," and on other school sides. Issues related to teaching in the DEI space and ensuring Jewish peoplehood is part of that curriculum. I've had a mom call me about one of her boys who are in 8th grade who in the hallways was said that Jews should go back to the oven. I've had a number of, unfortunately, different scenarios where parents are at a loss on how to engage their school community, their educators, the people that are with their students day in and day out, on how to approach this very difficult topic. And every situation is different. Every situation has its own way of sort of dealing with it. And we at AJC here are just trying to do our best to not only, unfortunately, keep up with the questions, but also try to proactively engage our communities as well in terms of how to deal with this terrible rise that's happening.
So, Aaron, are the remarks that teens are facing, as far as you hear, are they mostly racist, of a racist type against Jews, or are they also anti-Israel?
It's a fair question. My experience is that the second half of that, the latter with the anti-Israel piece, certainly comes up more when there is a situation, let's say, between Israel and Gaza, or Israel on the sort of conflict front is playing a much more decisive tone in the news. But I find when it's a very sort of low key time, that's less so the case. Whereas it's the more sort of Jewish bait tones that are coming up. I will say, certainly, the Kanye situation, Kyrie Irving situation, those certainly did not help matters. And I think those are just an example of where many young students are sort of hearing these sort of anti-Semitic rhetorics and then purveying that back to our students as well.
And does that also include other minority groups that engage in this anti-Semitic rhetoric, or is it just
really, every situation is different. Every situation, like I said, requires a different finesse and a different sort of way of approaching it. And so it's really unique on the way people come to us and explain their situation. So I wouldn't say there's one particular theme that I, from my point of view, is seeing one way or the other.
There's no pattern.
No, not again, not from the way where I sit, especially with high school students. But there might be on a more larger sort of thematic basis across the country, but not from my point of view.
Okay. What is the American Jewish Committee doing to empower students and their families to speak up against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just in general, I mean, I think it's important, if it's okay to plug, we have a program that I'm responsible for called Leaders for Tomorrow, or what we call our LIFT program. This is really rooted in not just being an educational model, but an action-oriented one. We'd call sort of the way that's seeing students to create change around Jewish identity and combating anti-Semitism is really one of our biggest goals. LIFT was created about 8 years ago to educate high school leaders about issues of importance affecting the global Jewish community. It really aims to help high school students develop a strong Jewish identity, train them as advocates, not just on combating anti-Semitism, but also advocates for Israel as well. But really, it's a way to inspire young Jews to prepare them with meaningful content, engage in critical thinking, and provide essential advocacy skills before they, go off to college or elsewhere in the post-high school career. So we really do our best to expose students to different stories and narratives, as we've just sort of talked about, and really get them to frame how they would approach, scenarios and think about how do they put themselves in those shoes. So if something were, to happen to them, they can think of proactive ways to engage with whatever situation arises. Yeah.
So
go ahead, sorry.
What I understand is that so you prepare them for certain scenarios. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, our goal is to make students confident and informed leaders on any issue, and obviously with anti-Semitism, having the background on the history of anti-Semitism, also recognizing there are different forms of anti-Semitism, understanding, as you sort of framed earlier, that where is the line between being anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist? When do students have to have an alert or awareness of there's sort of a crossroad or a threshold between being critical of the state of Israel versus being an anti-Semitic rhetoric towards a particular individual? And so we really work with students to try to understand those different dynamics and then get them to do role playing or other interactive models to put them in the sort of leadership role and how they would react.
Can you take
for my clarity, is there is anti-Zionism, so being against, opposing the existence of the Jewish state, is that considered anti-Semitic or not by the American Jewish Committee?
So it is considered that, but again, I think there's a lot of nuance there. I think it depends on the situation and how it's framed and how it's contextualized. So while that is, yes, correct, that we do see that is a situation where it's anti-Semitic, I think sometimes this day and age, the lines are so blurred that it really has to be on a sense of, here's how, as a Jewish leader, I'm going to approach this. And sometimes it can be tactful. Sometimes it has to be more direct and abrupt. Again, we really try to frame a number of different scenarios for students to decide how to do it. We've heard from students that, especially college students, when they're in a classroom with a professor and a large part of their peers, like how they interact, whether behind the scenes with the professor one-on-one or in front of their peers, any situation really provides a real nuance and tactful way of approaching it. And so we just want to give students an array of different scenarios and let them decide for themselves how they would approach it.
So can you give us an example of a scenario, very specific? I would really love our listeners to hear.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, not maybe so much on the sort of the specific anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, but I can just give you a few general sort of overviews of sort of success stories.
Yes, that's what I'd love to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, a colleague of mine was invited to an elite prep school in New York City a few weeks ago to address an entire student body, because one of our LIFT students was encouraged to go to her administration to have all students, not just Jews, learn about anti-Semitism, given that while anti-Semitism targets Jews, it's perpetuated by non-Jews. And so, again, at a preparatory school of this nature, the idea that the entire school was able to hear from our LIFT student and their head of school really emphasize the importance that these kids need to be aware of when it comes to anti-Semitism. AJC brings a lot of, like I said, nuance and understanding to everything we do. And the idea is that we really want to, again, empower our students and then speak to their community. Another way that we could think of an example is I had an Atlanta student come to us not too long ago. She's from a rural part of Georgia, but she goes to our Atlanta Lift program. And there she was one of a few handful, if not one of the token Jews in her rural high school. And she was able to explicitly speak up when she heard anti-Semitic rhetoric happening in her classroom and in the hallways. She contacted us as well about resources that she could give to her teachers. And again, these sort of small steps in a way of, one student can make a really big difference in a 700, 800 person size school or even grade. And the more that we can empower those students to just speak up would be really beneficial for everyone involved. Like I said earlier, I have a number of parents who've contacted me on how they can approach their administration. Again, while we target and work with LIFT students, parents are also an incredibly important body within this work, and how we can empower them, because their students, whether they're maybe not afraid, but certainly intimidated to speak up in front of their peers, parents also have the abilities to make certainly projecting noise when it comes to talking to administration. So we also work with parent bodies as well, and how they can be a voice for both their students and their communities too.
I think it's wonderful that you are empowering, Jewish students and their parents on how to speak up.
And if I can just add, thank you. I really appreciate it. And just two more quick examples. This year, I'm really excited that we're launching for the first time through AJC's Project Interchange program, heads of schools to attend our trip to Israel this summer. So we have 9 heads of schools from around the country, private heads of schools, that are going to Israel to learn about the nuances around the conflict, understanding why the long-term investment of AJC is really critical to help them, hopefully proactively, and certainly sometimes, unfortunately, reactively if they need to call upon us. But the more we can get heads of schools and those within the educational community involved in understanding the major issues happening with our Jewish student bodies today, can only be more impactful and proactive for our kids. And then lastly, this past March, we had 130 of our LIFT students fly from around the country to DC to do a 3-day advocacy program, meeting with staff members on the Hill, hearing from people like Ambassador Lipstadt, the State Department, and talking about why, not just why anti-Semitism is on the rise, but also how students can be proactive and build a leadership model to combat that, both nationally and within their local communities as well.
And your program is national, or is it regional?
Yes.
Okay.
No, it's national. AJC, we have 25 offices throughout the United States, and 12 of those 25 offices host LIFT along with a virtual cohort. So if students aren't accessible to one of our 12 AJC offices throughout the country, they can also apply through our virtual cohort to the LIFT program as well.
Okay. Aaron, if you could wave a magic wand and put programs into place, what other kinds of programs for helping Jewish teens who face anti-Semitism would you like to see?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, if financial matters and the sky is the limit in terms of like what we could accomplish. I mean, between myself and regional and national staff, we're really fortunate to have the support and the mechanisms needed to work with students, parents, synagogues, and whatever capacity is needed. I think coming from the educational background and the classroom perspective, I think, and the reason why we started this PI trip with heads of schools is that curriculum and pedagogy are really where we see the access point of helping students. I think particularly for educators in schools that aren't as aware, they're not, in certain areas with a large Jewish population, I think being able to really have a significant threshold on how curriculums are written, how presentations to parents and students through a generational lens and historical turning points can help invest in this generation's future. To me, the more we can get parents and students and even grandparents talking to each other and running programs that get them to hear one another, I think would be incredibly valuable. one area that I always found was interesting as I started my teaching career is that, for example, the Soviet Jewry movement, while it's very separate on this topic that we're discussing, I found over the years that majority of my high school students didn't know about that movement at all, even though it was one of the most pinnacle times within Jewish history, at least in the 20th century. And students today have no understanding about it. When they would go home, their parents would say, or their parents' parents would say, of course, I was involved in this. I went to the Soviet Union. I helped Soviet Jews, right, X, Y, and Z. And so to me, the more programs are set up for parents and students to speak to each other about Jewish history, Jewish peoplehood, and being involved and engaging together, and hearing also for parents about why their students look at Israel a particular way today, how they have a different way of looking at the political situation, whatever context it is. I think the more parents and family members and students that can engage with one another and programs that are set up to do that can only benefit the long-term growth of the Jewish community.
So that's Jewish parents talking with their Jewish children in a program, and learn about each other's experiences and outlooks on Jewish issues of today. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and certainly students maybe with one Jewish parent, one non-Jewish parent, but again, having that conversation, particularly if that student is involved in Jewish organizations, Jewish advocacy, and talking to the whatever parent or not or Jewish parents or non-Jewish parents are around, I think the more conversations around that sort of awareness and advocacy can only help. And that also, in my opinion, like sort of advocates or pushes parents to be more involved, particularly on the school front. And if they hear things that are happening, that gives them more incentive to speak up to the administrators and others, especially knowing that their students are so engaged and committed to this this conversation.
I can imagine that that's very powerful. Yes.
Wait, can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
It's very interesting that you mentioned Soviet Jewry, because I was on the editorial staff of the Jewish Exponent newspaper in Philadelphia in the 70s. And of course, we spent a lot of time on Soviet Jewry. And now I wonder if I ever told my two daughters, who are adults, about that effort. So I'm just smiling.
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, and someone like Natan Sharansky is a big hero of mine. And again, most students had never even heard of him. And to me, that's a shame.
Yeah. Yeah. Aaron, do you have a family history that led you to teach Jewish history and then be involved in this program?
No, I do actually, and thank you for asking. So as you mentioned, I grew up in Danvers, Massachusetts, about 20 minutes north of Boston. And I really grew up in sort of two different worlds. I was a product of the Danvers public school system, where I was one of just only a handful of Jewish students, K through 12. But then I also had my sort of Jewish side, where I was involved intimately with my synagogue, USY youth group, my camp. And so I had two different worlds I was sort of balancing, particularly going into high school. And when it comes to Jewish history, my father was someone who was a very staunch Zionist, as was my mom and her family as well. I grew up in my living room had a picture of my great grandfather at the Kotel Western Wall, my grandfather, my father, and so I just knew one day that going to Israel was a really important aspect for him, and learning about Jewish history. And regarding this particular podcast, just thinking about how I grew up. Fortunately, I have very few memories of any anti-Semitism happening around me. But what I do recall very distinctly are when it comes to sort of Jewish history. Certainly with Israel, I grew up in high school at the time during the Second Intifada, and that was a very profound time to be learning about Jewish history and understanding the issues around the Middle East. And at this point, thinking reflectively, I'm sure there were moments where there was conversation in my classrooms about Israel that I didn't at the time recognize as maybe being anti-Semitic, and they could have been. But I do remember, having conversations with my peers around what's happening there. And I was one of the few that actually was engaging with the news and understood the context and nuances around it. And so while anti-Semitism might have not been a direct case on my mind, certainly understanding the Jewish history lens of Israel at that time was really significant and really brought me to being a history major at American University in DC, and ultimately wanting to be an educator. I didn't think about being an educator, particularly in the Jewish world. I was just wanted to be a history teacher. But the more I learned about Middle East history, the more I learned as a Jewish history minor about areas that were really important to me, and understanding that the connection I had personally, it just made more and more sense to kind of go in that direction. And I'm really fortunate that ever since I left grad school, that this world has been something that has, I've been really impactfully engaged in. And I feel that my students from JDS and beforehand, I hope have had a really significant impact on how they've seen the Jewish community and their Jewish livelihood as well.
So what can you, from your experience, what can you share with our listeners on an everyday level, how they can answer anti-Semitic comments said to them, such as one that's so simple but goes back to medieval tropes? When someone says they think it's a compliment, for example, you don't have to answer this one, I'm just giving an example.
Sure.
Jews are very good at money. And we know that that's a really dangerous statement, because it leads to the whole medieval trope of blah, blah, Jews control money in the world and blah, blah. So you have any tips for the rest of us who aren't in this program, or parents that call you?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, advocacy is tough. Advocacy has not come easily to many students or many, people in general to that point, no matter what age they are. I mean, as AJC's first director of high school affairs, is certainly, like I mentioned earlier, a question I think about in terms of how can we most have the deepest impact on students and how they advocate for themselves, and thinking about, the big picture on what they would do in certain situations. But the approach my colleagues and I take, whether it's for students, families, schools, we want to provide guidance, we want to provide resources, and ultimately support this community however we can in whatever situation they arise in. So, I know you're probably looking for a really explicit example. It's all a matter of degrees, a matter of what happened. But we aren't going to be, as AJC's point of view, we don't want to be banging down the doors looking for the spotlight. We want to empower students to find their voice, offer schools help in shaping a program or curriculum that's in the best interest of their needs, not ours. And if I could work with every educator, administrator to help perform and provide a better context within their Holocaust studies. I mean, I'm sure many of your listeners are knowing that, there's a lot in the news now about Holocaust education today, and passing in terms of how many states provide that amount of education, which is a really big deal. And AJC is helping work on that. Whatever we can do to both educate the schools, which will then help filter down to our students, which then hopefully, as I mentioned earlier, students can tell their parents, and we build that big tent. I really believe that hopefully down the road, that this rise of anti-Semitism will hopefully improve and dramatically decrease. And I just, that's how I sort of see the big picture working long term.
You just said something very interesting. You said you're the first director of high school. So I take it that as anti-Semitism has increased, filtered down from college to high school, middle school, AJC saw a need, and that's why this program is just right.
That is correct. Yes.
So
fortunately,
right.
Lyft has been around, like I said, for about 8 years now, and it's only growing more. And the more it grew, obviously, there was a need to really solidify and try to, expand where we could. And with my background in education and as history teacher in the classroom, it made sense to sort of take an educator's perspective and apply that to, keep increasing the size of Lyft. So yes, thank you for mentioning that.
And so, so the flip side is that the problem's growing and that we really need you. I mean, that's what I thought was interesting. We're coming near to the end. Do you have last thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
So first off, not to be someone to plug stuff, but our applications for Lyft are open right now. People can go to the website, ajc.org/LFT, to look at our application to apply. This is for 9th to 12th graders. Otherwise, I would just like to end by saying, the AJC community is there for everyone, students, parents, the community at large. We want to help you however we can. We want to be proactively involved in your communities. And just to end that, I really appreciate this podcast and those that are helping, get the word out about anti-Semitism and why it's on the rise and how we can certainly make an impact on decreasing it over time. AJC, for those who don't know, put out a tremendous poll not too long ago and in the late fall about this situation. And the more people are aware and educated about it, hopefully we'll see a vast improvement moving forward.
Yes. So thank you for your effort. Thank you for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate our listeners listening and doing whatever they can to help. For those of you who have not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, you can see it on Amazon and YouTube. You can learn more about my free nonfiction Holocaust theater project at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we end every program, we say, please, without putting yourself in physical harm, speak up whenever you can against anti-Semitism and all hate.